Today, I'm going to show you 3 ways that you can work on your strength and joint mobility in one efficient workout. The 3 things that we're going to cover are working full range of motion in your lifts, incorporating loaded stretches, and end range strength training. Each joint in your body has a full range of motion in order for it to function at its full capacity. For example, your shoulder joint is capable of reaching 180 to 190 degrees. This is what allows you to bring your arms overhead when you're doing things like throwing, lifting things overhead, or just hanging. But due to the process of aging, injury, lifestyle, our joint range of motion decreases over time and it becomes restricted in certain movements, especially when we don't pay any particular attention to it in our training or daily habits. But the good news is, with mobility training, you can regain and own all of your range of motion in most cases. So for number 1, let's jump straight into working our full range of motion. This is going to help us build strength and mobility simultaneously. It's important to note that lifting with full range of motion is not mobility training, and if you're currently experiencing joint pain or restrictions, then simply working full range of motion isn't necessarily going to fix them. With that said, it does play an important part in the strengthening of your range of motion. You can also think of mobility as a form of daily activity, where you try to move each joint in as many ways as possible through their full range of motion. This is what is going to help you maintain overall mobility as you age, and one way to ensure that we move through our full range of motion is by using it when we lift weights. So the first example of a full range of motion exercise is going to be the squat. So I'm going to get Hallie to do a full range of motion squat to demonstrate what it looks like when we do ass to grass. So that's full range of motion all the way down as much as your mobility will allow and back up. And then partial range of motion might just be to 90 degrees where she gets halfway, pauses and comes back up. So when we're working full range of motion exercises, we're trying to go all the way down to our end range of motion. So this is not just a full ass to grass squat. What we've actually got going on here is full range of motion in knee flexion and full range of motion in hip flexion. And then we're using a lot of ankle dorsiflexion as well. So we're working those joints. So if Hallie was always just squatting to 90 degrees and she was never working the full range of motion of the joints, she would never be working that area between this 90 degrees and lower. And that's why it's so important to build strength throughout your full range of motion. A lot of times in life, we can go throughout our day without ever hitting these ranges in full knee flexion and full hip flexion and even ankle dorsiflexion. Having a practice where you work your exercises through their full range of motion just ensures that you're working these ranges on a daily basis. You're much less likely to lose it over time. The reason Hallie can get all the way down to the ground and back up is because she has good joint range of motion. But this isn't the case for everyone, and if you're someone that's restricted in a squat, you don't have to try and force this by loading it up. What you can do is you can try it on an incline. So here we're using a slant board. You can use any kind of heel raise or even Olympic lifting shoes. And then what she can do is she can still work full range of motion in her knees, full range of motion in her hips, getting the benefit there, but now there's just a little bit less requirement from her ankles. Another example of when we use full range of motion when we're training is when we're doing bench press. So full range of motion on a bench press just looks exactly like Hallie's demonstrating. She's not overarching her back in order for her body to meet the bar. She's got adequate shoulder extension. She's got rotational mobility in the shoulders as well that allow her to bring the bar down to her chest. So it's really common in people who lift that have shoulder restrictions when they start getting down towards that end range of motion. So they're loading it up, going down into that stretch position. They don't have the mobility to get all the way down bar to the chest. So they'll often experience anterior shoulder pain. If this is the case, then I don't recommend forcing the range of motion. Instead, this is an opportunity to do a joint assessment, find out where your restrictions are. Once you know where your restrictions are, then you can work on those with joint-specific mobility exercises. This is something that I'm going to cover in point 3 of this video. You can see how this would work in so many different exercises, like Romanian deadlifts, pull-ups, lateral squats, Bulgarian split squats. You can do these with partial range of motion, or you can do these with full range of motion when your joints function as they should. Now let's move on to number 2, loaded stretches. This is very similar to lifting with your full range of motion, but not entirely the same, because now your intention has changed from the load where you're trying to build strength and muscle to the stretch. So the intention now is to work on your flexibility, and this often requires that you use far less load than you would if you were not pausing at your end range of motion. So in the other exercises, we're using full range of motion, but we weren't pausing at the end. With the loaded stretches, we're going to be pausing at the end and holding those as a stretch, which requires a lot of isometric strength at your end range in order to stabilize that position. This then translates into joint stability as well. For example, with the dumbbell pullover, I would typically work this exercise at about 70% effort, sometimes taking it to failure in order to build strength and muscle. But as a loaded stretch, I would then lower the weight and emphasize the stretch to build strength and stability at my end range of motion. Typically, you would hold the stretch for a specific amount of time, or you could do paused reps where you go to your end range of motion and just hold it for a shorter period of time. Usually, you're going to be focusing on the eccentric phase, so the stretching part of the lift, and working with some kind of tempo. For example, 4 seconds on the eccentric phase with a 4-second pause at your end range of motion. So some other exercises where you would utilize loading that stretch would be loaded butterflies, the Poliquin fly, the diagonal stretch, sissy squats, pancake, deficit split squat, seated good morning, Jefferson curl. You can see how this extends to so many different types of exercises. Number 3, this is where we move on to end range strength training. This is what we typically refer to as mobility training, because this is what we use to work on any joint restrictions that we might have. Mobility training exercises often involve a lot of isometrics at your end range of motion, often using your body as resistance or creating internal force to make neurological changes to your joints. End range strength training is joint specific, which makes it ideal for you if you have restrictions you need to work on. For example, if your shoulder internal rotation is restricted, then you can use shoulder internal rotation isometrics to help build strength at your end range of motion. So for this example, we could use shoulder internal rotation pails and rails from the sleeper position. Hallie's just lying down on her side. She's gone into shoulder internal rotation and she's using this hand to passively, so this is just a passive stretch, with the assistance of her hand to find her end range of motion, which she can then hold for 1 to 2 minutes to allow her neurological system to kind of adapt to this position. After those 2 minutes are up, this is when we start doing the isometrics to build strength in this position. So it's not enough to just hold it passively for a set amount of time. To do the pails and rails, we're going to do contractions on either side of the joint. So the first one, Hallie's going to keep her hand on top here, still applying pressure, but now she's going to try and drive this hand, so she's externally rotating her shoulder, but not allowing it to move for 10 seconds, pushing into that hand, Hallie. And then after those 10 seconds are up, she's going to take this hand under here and push into it. She can use this hand to really push down and create some internal rotation, or she can remove it and push down as far into that as she can. Once those 10 seconds are up, she's going to place her hand back down on here, just push back into that stretch and repeat that process up to 3 times for an entire set. So another example of a mobility exercise is, let's just say that Hallie is restricted in hip internal rotation. Then what we can do is again get Hallie to lay in a sleeper position, but this time we're going to be working on hip internal rotation. I've added an ankle weight to this to make the exercise more challenging. This is not an isometric exercise. This is going to be Hallie actively working to strengthen her hip internal rotation. So to do this, she's going to drive this knee down into the other knee, and then she's going to raise her heel as high as she can. And she's engaging those muscles that are responsible for internally rotating her hip. So she can treat this as a strength exercise. And what you often do with an exercise like this is incorporate an isometric hold at the end range of motion to build strength in this position. This is just an example of 2 end range strength exercises. There are many more. For example, shoulder external rotation pails and rails, shoulder external rotation lift-offs, ankle dorsiflexion pails and rails, big toe extension, shoulder flexion lift-offs, swimmer hovers. The list goes on and on. If you're interested in learning more about mobility training and how you can assess and program it for your clients, then check out our CPD certified mobility course. We also have a CPD certified mobility and strength course where we teach you how to blend both.
All right, so in the strength and mobility certification, we go through so many different exercises where we go from the beginning, where someone may be with restricted range of motion, really struggling to do even partial reps, to doing full range of motion by basically addressing every single joint function in that lift and progressing you through various different mobility, stability, and strength progressions to get there. So that takes up the majority of the course, including summaries of a huge amount of recent studies that explain why you'd be using those specific lifts or those specific ranges and what the benefits are, because there's a lot of really cool science recently coming out that is very much more focused on mobility and strength, which is super, super cool. So that's starting to now come out and prove the point of so many people that have been doing these advanced techniques on social media that haven't quite been studied yet. So that's also covered. But also, one of the big major things that we made a big effort to cover is different methodologies you can use with your clients and with yourself. Whoever basically is a beginner in certain ranges, what to do with that. So you don't want to just jump in and go to full strength and mobility sessions where you're doing everything to the most advanced methods, because you might just not be ready for that and your body needs more time. Connective tissue takes a huge amount of time to adapt. First, you're looking at neurological changes, then you're looking at muscular changes, and then you're looking at connective tissue adaptations, and that can all take 1 to 2 years in certain regions of your body, depending on what you're restricted in. So we don't want you to, obviously, with absolutely everybody, go to the super advanced methodologies straight away, which is why we've also created basically a bunch of different methods you can use for different skill levels and different experience levels, basically beginner all the way to advanced, so that you can use those methods to slowly bring yourself gradually, safely into full range of motion training. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe and drop a comment below what you'd like us to cover next.